So this is Rabbi Lawrence Troster, and this is the fifth of a six-lecture series on how the Bible became the Bible. And this recording is from October 13th, 2016 at Kesher, Israel in Westchester, Pennsylvania. So tonight we're going to try and complete the four schools, again using the term advisedly, of the documentary hypothesis. We looked at the priestly school. We're going to start with the D, the Deuteronomic school. Then we're going to look at the J and the E, or the E and the J. And if we have time, we're going to look at some of the oldest texts in the Hebrew Bible, which are really interesting because that's going to take us one further step back. Next week, we're actually going to look at archaeological remains, ancient inscriptions, and various other things, and there'll be lots of pictures. Okay. So I gave you again the chart on the page one, just so you have it in front of you in case you didn't bring the material from last week. And we're going to start by looking at how the book of Deuteronomy is put together. So we have what's called DTR1, and that's the original edition. And that's probably, when we looked at the story last week of Josiah finding a book in the temple, or at least the Chilkiah, the high priest did, and reading it to Josiah, that's probably DTR1. Okay? DTR2 is probably the edition, the second edition of Deuteronomy, that could be as late as after the Babylonian exile. And then there is something called DTN, which is the law code in Deuteronomy, that pre-exists Deuteronomy and was added to Deuteronomy by DTR1. So it was an independent document of laws that often are refer back, comment on, adjust, interpret the law code in Exodus, which is again the E source used that. And so the Deuteronomic historian liked it and put it, or DTR1 put it into Deuteronomy. And then, of course, the books after Deuteronomy are the DH, which is the Deuteronomic historians. So if you take a look, you'll see here is an outline. And if you took all the DTR2s out of the book of Deuteronomy, you'd still have a substantial book basically governing most of the ideas. And you just have, so if you want to take a look at what one of the additions are, if you want to look at Deuteronomy chapter 4, verse 25, which is found on page 384, you will see this is an addition that is post-exilic because it assumes that there was an exile. In other words, you can tell because it refers to the Babylonian exile here. So either in Babylon or after the exile, they added in these things to kind of show that the Babylonian exile was and the destruction of the temple was part and parcel of the original covenantal teachings that were in DTR1. So that's just one example of how DTR2 adds in things that change and add another layer to the interpretation. And as you can see, a large part of the book from chapter 12, verse 1 to 26:15, that's the law code. That's the biggest chunk, and was put in the original edition. Now, if you go to the next page, you'll see how, the last chapters are the most complicated in terms of the sources. And one of the interesting things is that this week's Parsha Hazinu, chapter 32, is a very old poem that DTR2 put in. Okay? And we know that from what's said just before it and what's said just after it. And we'll be looking at that in the Torah study this week. And as I mentioned to some of you before the rest of you got here, and this answers one of your questions, or somebody's question, maybe yours, George, there actually is a significant textual variant in chapter 2 of them in chapter 32 between what's in the Dead Sea Scrolls versus what we have in the Masoretic that changes the meaning significantly. And we're going to look at that on Saturday. Okay, so that's a bit of a teaser. So you have this very old poem, and then you have another old poem, which is chapter 33, which is the last testament of Moses. So they're put in by DTR2 or DTR1 in the case of chapter 33. But then notice you have the final redactor sticking in something, the latter part of chapter 32. So why don't we take a look at that so you get an idea what we're talking about. So this is Parshat Hazinu, but if you take a look in it, at the end of the chapter, which is not part of the poem, you'll see from verses 48 through 52, this seems to be the redaction, the final redactor, in order to bring it into line with the narrative at the end of the book of Numbers. Because at the end of the book of Numbers, it talks about how they're waiting on the other side of the Jordan near Jericho to go into the land, and this Deuteronomy is Moses' sort of final speeches before he dies. So in order to kind of hearken back to that, that's what this section at the end of chapter 32 was added by the redactor to kind of align the sources together. And then what's really interesting is that if you go to chapter 34, which is the last chapter of it, which is on page 453, the first part of it, the first 4 verses, are DTR1, okay, which talks about where he is, and that Moses isn't going to see it. And then you have a bit of J text that if you go back to, as you'll see with the narrative, this is a kind of way, the last part of the narrative of J, which is verses 5 to 7. Okay, that Moses died and he got buried by God and how old he was. But then you then have the P text adding in verses 8 and 9. Okay, and then the final verses is back to DTR1. So what you have is a very complicated way of ending, and it's kind of like each source kind of had their final say about Moses and his death, and the final redactors had kind of put it all in there to make sure it all kind of all aligned together. Okay? Any questions at this point? Now, when we looked a little bit of it, but the Deuteronomic historian, or historians, I would like to say, I don't think it's the work of one person, were the ones who did the final edit on Joshua, Judges, Samuels, and Kings. And they utilized a lot of old material. The book of Joshua is pretty much Deuteronomic right through and through. But when you get to Judges, you've got some really old folk tales and ancient sources and various other things like the stories of the stories of Samson. You've got some pretty old material there, some of it going way back. And when you get to the book of Samuels, what you have in Samuels, and this is Robert Alter's theory, is in effect you had somebody who wrote most of it as a kind of book of the lives of Samuel, Saul, and David. That Robert Alter believes that most of 1st and 2nd Samuels and the beginning of 1st Kings was a composition by a single author who utilized earlier materials, who may have actually interviewed some of the people involved, and that he thinks it could have been written within 50 years of the life of David's. Okay? So it's really quite interesting. Alter proposes this in his commentary to 1st and 2nd Samuels, which he originally published as a separate volume called The David Story. And we're actually going to be doing that as one of our Thursday night lectures, is to look at the life of Samuel, Saul, and David as a novel. But whatever was written by this person, who was a in some ways a literary genius, the Deuteronomic historians had their final word. And they added in a few things because they wanted to make David look better. Okay? Because he's a very complex and many ambiguous kind of character in many ways. Okay? Yeah.
Any sense of who the redactor was?
Well, some people think it was Ezra, that Ezra might have been the redactor. It's quite possible. But I don't think it was a single person. I think it probably, the first major redaction could probably happen in Babylon. There very likely was another, sort of layer of editing once they came back. That's the best we can say. I mean, there's all kinds of theories about it. Yeah.
To refresh my memory, the DTR1, DTR2, we don't have any of those copies.
Well, we have what's in the book of Deuteronomy. I mean, it's...
No, I'm saying we don't have the original without it.
No, we don't. No, but that's...
So we know, or we suspect, someone suspect that it was written because the language was used is different
Yes.
from the other.
Yes.
You said it was.
Yeah.
And because now we found the Dead Scroll.
Well, that's less important, but the fact is that when people analyze the language and the rhetoric of Deuteronomy, it fits in very nicely with the early 7th century, late 8th, early 7th century BCE. It has some, it shows some influences from other ancient Near Eastern literature in its style, and the language definitely is different than P and E and J. And so we can approximate, and we'll get to that in a second, we can kind of date it and figure out, what its setting was.
So these ideas, if I'm correct, were there before they found Dead Sea Scrolls.
Oh, yeah.
Dead Sea Scrolls confirm some of the ideas that they found.
Well, the Dead Sea Scrolls just are our earliest sources.
Right.
And we, as I said, there's a lot of fragments or pieces of books of Deuteronomy. But this is hundreds of years before any of our Dead Sea Scrolls, so it doesn't, it's already been edited together.
So the scholars can precisely notice that 3 lines
Yeah.
in the whole segment, that
Yeah.
3 lines are added
Yeah,
500 years after, or 1,000,
not that long.
whatever, but can do that? I mean,
Yeah, they can. I mean, it doesn't mean that there aren't arguments over it, because they do. Because arguing over whether one verse really is this or not, I mean, some of them are pretty clear and some of them are not. And as you will see, it's a big problem when you're trying to disentangle J and E. Okay? Yeah.
Sure, like Isaiah, they're still arguing if it's 2 prophets or 3 prophets.
Right, exactly. It was, second Isaiah. Is second Isaiah, which is from chapter 40 to the end of the book, is it from one person? Is it from 2 people? Or is it more than that? And it's interesting, in that particular case, the Jewish scholars think that second Isaiah was 1 person, and non-Jewish scholars think it was 2 at least. Yeah.
I would think as technology is advanced, this study, I wouldn't say becomes easier, but becomes more exact. And it may not be much different than if I'm writing a paper and decide to grab some text from someplace else and drop it in my paper. With the programs that are available, a professor at the university, if they want to scan my paper, they can pick out, well, this is an original thought because I haven't given attribution. It just came from someplace.
Well, it's in some cases the seams are easy to find, and other cases they're not. Okay, it's just a fact of it. So the setting of Deuteronomy, as I mentioned before, is definitely after the destruction of the northern kingdom in the 8th century BCE. What the theory is that the people, the refugees from the north, came south into Judea. As I said, archaeological evidence shows that Jerusalem expanded enormously at that time, its acreage, and that cannot be explained by natural increase. So there must have been, hundreds, if not thousands, of refugees who come from the destruction of the north, who escape the Assyrians because the Assyrians exiled a whole bunch of people. That's where the legend of the 10 lost tribes come from. And one of the things they bring is their own traditions, and there seems to be a reformist school that forms around a certain group of prophets and priests, of which Jeremiah was one of them, because of the experience of the north, of what happened in the north. They influenced the king in the south, Hezekiah, who is the king in Judea during that destruction. He begins to enact some reforms which are in line with Deuteronomy, but he doesn't do it like in depth, and they don't last because the next couple of kings revert back to what before, especially Manasseh, who becomes an ally of Assyria and starts to introduce some Assyrian worship things into the temple in Jerusalem. When Josiah comes along, and they find the text of probably DTR1, he's the one who really enacts the deep and lasting reforms. That he shuts down all the shrines. So we actually kind of know what the historical circumstances are as to what brought about it, the Deuteronomic thing. So, and that, of course, brings us to what is the theology of Deuteronomy. And here, the first and most important thing is a very strict monotheism. In other words, even more than the P people. All right, if the P people, the priestly school, were fairly strict monotheists, and Deuteronomic people are more so. And what was, and it had to do with their conception of God and the function of the temple and all kinds of things. So that's number one. And so in the book of Deuteronomy, you get this, from the Torah, you get the strongest statements of monotheism in the Torah are found in the book of Deuteronomy. And you'll understand why I'm saying that. I mean, you say, well, isn't the rest of the book monotheistic? Not as strict as Deuteronomy. In other words, monotheism isn't a single way of looking at things. It's a kind of sliding scale. And when you look at the way in which people actually have practiced their religion, including Jews, Christians, and Muslims, who are all avowed monotheists, you will find a broad range of what that means. And to call somebody, our ancestors not being monotheists, we might look at them and say, but that sounds like pagan practices. The answer is yeah, because they had a very much wider and broader definition of what monotheism is. And that would, the broader definition would include things like angels and demons and, all kinds of, magic and everything like that. Well, the Deuteronomic people, they didn't like any of that. So there's no demons, no angels, okay? And they, of course, so they have a much narrower idea of what monotheism is. Yeah.
Just a comment that we think of our ancestors all being monotheists, but the prophets riled against idol worship, and some of the temples were changed, and they brought that.
Well, sometimes it's hard to know who exactly they're yelling at. But I think sometimes they are talking about, but because there isn't any real archaeological evidence, very little of it, that the Israelites actually worshipped idols or worshipped the gods of their neighbors. The question was less about which god you're worshiping, but what was the nature of that god? How do you worship that god? All right? And that's where the significant arguments come in. And we'll get more into that when we look at the older sources, which are a lot looser on some of these ideas. So that's number one. Secondly, the notion of loyalty to God, which is found, of course, very strongly in the text, where it emphasizes the covenant, and your loyalty to the covenant becomes something more than what you find in Exodus, for example, where it's kind of a king and a vassal. It's very formal. This is emotional. They bring in emotional loyalty, so to speak, as part of that. And just to skip to E, that's where you have the love of God is only found in Deuteronomy. That is one of the central ideas. It's not enough to worship God and to believe God is one, but you have to love God. That's the first chapter, the first paragraph of the Shema. You shall love the Lord your God. And that's not the only time it says that. And another verse that's used, cleave to your God. And the verb to cleave has connotations of intimacy, and when it's about humans, it's sexuality. It's, in other words, There's a strong emotional element to the spirituality that's in Deuteronomy that you don't find in the earlier books of the Torah. Okay? The concept of God, this is where it's really critical. In the other schools, they believed that God had, I'm going to use the word right out there, had a body. It wasn't like our body, it wasn't made out of the same stuff, but God had a physical form. And that physical form lived in heaven, but could come down on earth. And in the priestly theology, that form lived in the temple, had come down from heaven to live in the temple. In the earlier text, you'll see that form can appear in more than one place at the same time. It has that ability. But the Deuteronomic people are having none of that. They're saying God never comes down from heaven. God's voice can come down from heaven, but God does not come down from heaven. The Deuteronomic conception of God is highly transcendent, to use a technical philosophical term. And in the temple, there's no physical presence of God there, and the temple is called in Deuteronomy the place where God has his name dwell. Now, name can be your name is in a way almost you. In other words, the separation between your name and your physical self, especially in the early text of the Bible, is very close. But nonetheless, it's an abstracting of God that you don't find in the earlier texts in the Torah. And that has had a huge influence on later Judaism. The idea, we tend to see God in more abstract terms, and one of the reasons is because of the influence of Deuteronomy. This idea of the transcendent God who connects to God's creation, but not through physical presence, but rather through revelation. So that's a critical idea. Anybody want to ask any questions at this point? Okay, the other thing is the people Israel, the interconnection between the people and the land. You find this in a way that is extremely strong. I mean, it's found in the other books, in the priestly material, but it's very strong. The notion that the people, the land, and God are a kind of indivisible idea. And therefore, when the health of the land depends on the health of the relationship between God and the people. So you have, for example, in chapter 11 of Deuteronomy, it's very clear they're saying there that the land of Israel is not like the land of Egypt, where there's a nice big river and you could just, work and whatever, that it was dependent on rainfall, which meant it depended upon the goodwill of God for fertility. That God has a particular concern, even though God is the God of the whole world, God has a particular concern for the land of Israel and for the people. And you cannot divide. It's very much like the way Native Americans are attached to their land. That, you can't be a Navajo outside of, in a certain sense, outside of Navajo land. I mean, the Navajo have all kinds of interesting rituals and healing rituals where, they make those sand paintings and all this kind of stuff. And they themselves, most of the Navajo believe you can't do those rituals outside their territory. They don't work. And so we had a more indigenous way of understanding ourselves in relationship to the land, which is one of the reasons why when we're exiled, it's such an incredible shock. Because the question is then, well, can you worship God outside the land of Israel? Yes, Dan.
Well, the ancient Egyptians also had the same concept that the flow of the Nile was dependent on God, on the gods.
Yes.
And they had to be appeased, and if they were angry, the flow wouldn't happen.
Yeah, but let's face it, when you got a nice big river, it's a lot easier to have water handy than if you are dependent on rainfall, which is still true to this day in Israel, right? Okay, the other thing, of course, is that law is very important in D, like it is in E and in P, but the law code here is, when you look at it in terms of the total book, it's a huge percentage of it. So the idea that the covenant is fulfilled through law is really important, and that meant day-to-day practices. One of the characteristics of the Deuteronomy school is the centralization of worship. I mentioned this before, but the big Deuteronomic reform was not merely shut down the pagan shrines, shut down the shrines to God and all the local temples, which Josiah did. We have archaeological evidence of it. Because the only place that God should be worshipped is in the temple in Jerusalem. And the reasons for it are because it was felt that, well, there's all kinds of potential reasons for it, but one of them is that local shrines can be more subject, perhaps, to pagan influence. And by having a centralized temple, you can control the priesthood better, make sure they're doing the right thing. There's various theories that have been advanced for it. Some say it was political or whatever, but in the end, it really radically changes the whole nature of Second Temple religion, and it changes what happens in Judaism. As I said last time, we really don't have, again, with a couple of minor exceptions, we don't have any other temples where sacrifice is done. Only the temple in Jerusalem is considered holy on that level. And it's the reason why it becomes the focal point in the Second Temple period for Jews throughout the ancient world, and why they come on pilgrimage. In hundreds of thousands come on pilgrimage, why they support the temple, and why the temple becomes so critical, and why in the Second Temple period people fight over it so much in terms of who's running it properly. It becomes a symbol of unity and disunity at the same time. If you had local shrines, it wouldn't be such a big deal. You don't like the way we're doing in Jerusalem? Okay, we're over here in Arad, we're going to do it our way. Okay? There you go. Any questions at this point? Okay. The other thing that's interesting is desacralization. There's very little about sacrifice in Deuteronomy. It's a minimal amount. They don't really... the concept of holiness, the way it is in the priestly school, which is so critical for them, it's not central to Deuteronomy. They consider the ark to be just a box that the Ten Commandments were in. There's no, gold and stuff. And when you get right down to it, there aren't a lot of sacrifices mentioned. It's just, and a very few purity laws, which are really big in the priestly school. You just don't have it. So in some, and one critical point, Dan, before you ask your question, is the whole level of the dietary laws. Now, in the P text, again, there's not 100% agreement on this, but it would seem that originally, when you had local shrines, all animals that were slaughtered for food had to be done at a local shrine by a priest. Because it was considered a sacred act. You were killing a fellow creature, and part of the animal had to be given to God, where it was put on burned on the altar. Part of it was given to the priest as a way of supporting the priest, and then the rest of it was eaten in a sacred meal. That you just couldn't kill an animal for meat unless you were hunting. Hunting was different, but domestic animals had to be slaughtered in a sacral way. Well, when you have only one place where this could happen, it makes life very difficult. So Deuteronomy permits secular slaughter, which is where our present-day kashrut system comes from. Even though the principles are laid out in Leviticus, Deuteronomy repeats pretty much the same thing about what animals are permitted and what aren't, but it allows people to kill animals in a non-sacral way. Yes, Dan?
It would almost seem that Deuteronomy is a more modern version of Judaism than the other JPs and all that. But from what you've taught us, Deuteronomy has some very old elements too.
Yes, it does. It does. But I think it is a radical revolution in terms of the especially, the priestly tradition, there are some big differences between them. And the emphasis, and the last thing, and I want to, if you look at K, it says humanitarianism. We might instead say social justice. One of the critical elements that's found in Deuteronomy it's not that it isn't in Exodus or Leviticus, but there is a real big emphasis on the notion of tzedek, which can be translated as righteousness or justice or equity. There are more laws about that than you find anywhere else in the Torah. And they're very day-to-day stuff. I mean, again, there are parallel laws to some of them in Leviticus and in Exodus, but there are much more of them in Deuteronomy, that the notion of social justice and protection of the helpless and the poor and things like that, there's a much bigger emphasis in the law codes in Deuteronomy than you find in Exodus and Leviticus. Now, again, not that they aren't there, but they're critical in Deuteronomy. And that's what is described here as the humanitarianism. Focusing, again, the desacralization, the less emphasis on ritual and sacrifice, focusing more on what we would call social justice as an important means of how so in other words, in addition to having to worship, God in the right way, you also have to have a just society. At the beginning of what we call Parshat Shoftim, where it talks about you have to have judges that are not corrupt. There's a famous sentence that I'm sure you all heard of, tzedek, tzedek tirdof, justice, justice you shall seek. The end of that verse says, your ability to live on the land is dependent on whether or not you create a society in which there is tzedek. Yeah.
It's almost as if Deuteronomy is preparing the Jewish people for the end of the temple period.
Well, yeah, that's an interesting point. I mean, and I don't know the answer to that, but the point is, one of the things you do find in Deuteronomy is the notion of exile. It's evident that DTR2 is written either in the Babylonian exile or after the Babylonian exile, because it's obvious they've gone through that experience. So that whole experience, to be without a temple and to be in exile, is incorporated into the theology. And you see this especially strong in some of the Deuteronomic historian text. The most important is 1 Kings chapter 8, okay, where the whole center part of it is Deuteronomic, and it's all about a temple in which there is no sacrifice, there's only prayer. And what happens if it gets destroyed, and notions of repentance and praying towards Jerusalem. I mean, it's amazing. It was probably written in the Babylonian exile, that part of it.
Rabbi,
Yeah.
is there any visible connection between Cyrus's laws, which seem to be like very modern in that age, and the return from Babylon?
Well, we know that Cyrus, when the Persian Empire conquered the Babylonians, Cyrus issued a decree that allowed the Judeans to return and rebuild Jerusalem and rebuild the temple. So that was huge. And when Cyrus is even mentioned in a couple of books in the Bible as being the Mashiach, the anointed one, like he is a savior figure. And the Persian Empire was, compared to the Babylonians or the Assyrians, was a relatively tolerant empire in terms of allowing local ethnic groups to rebuild their temples, to worship their gods in their own way, and to rule themselves on a local level. So it's a good question. I don't know what kind of impact. I mean, some people feel it was in fact the Persians' influence that caused the canonization of the Torah itself, because the Persians wanted all the local ethnic groups to establish themselves according to their ancestral traditions. It's an interesting theory. Okay, one other thing that I haven't mentioned yet about Deuteronomy is the intellectual orientation. There is a strong element of the notion of studying the laws, studying the covenant. And it is from, in the first paragraph, you shall teach this to your children, right? There's a strong element of the notion that the study of the covenant is important. One of the last parts of the Torah, it was in last week's Parsha, is every 7 years you're supposed to gather everybody together and read the whole Torah out to them. In other words, the whole notion of reading the Torah in public, studying the Torah, has its origins in Deuteronomy. So that intellectualism that we think is so much part of Judaism really has its origins in Deuteronomy. And this is where Deuteronomy seems to have some connections with the wisdom tradition that produced the book of Proverbs and some of the Psalms and the book of Job and Ecclesiastes, which is highly a whole intellectual tradition that's outside of the schools that we've been talking about. But there seems to be a connection between the Deuteronomic school and the wisdom people, because there is a certain amount in Deuteronomy that sounds like wisdom literature. Okay? Anybody have any other questions about D at this point? Okay, so now let's go back to the two earliest sources. And the first one is E. And E is, there's a lot missing from E. In other words, I told you, when you look at P, you can get a complete narrative from the creation of the world down to the death of Moses. And, there's a lot that's not there, but you can get a nice running narrative. You can't do that with E. But when you look at the texts that are from E, you'll see, of course, some of the most important stories in the Bible from E, including the binding of Isaac, for example, and a whole bunch of you see there's a lot of stuff from the patriarchal stories. You'll see there's a fair bit about in the Exodus story. And what's key about E is, of course, E is the one who brings, the E tradition has the Ten Commandments and the laws that follow the Ten Commandments, what's called Parshat Mishpatim. And this is an older text that is incorporated into E, but it represents the common law of ancient Israel. You'll see that there's parts of Numbers, and a little bit, as I pointed out in Deuteronomy, but that's it. There's not a lot there compared to when you look at P, or as you will see when you look at J. So what are the emphasis in E? Well, first of all, prophetic leadership. Emphasized in E is the notion that Moses is the leader. Big emphasis on Moses. And that prophets are the ones who are the leaders, not the priests, interestingly enough. The prophets are. There, unlike Deuteronomy where you get the love of God, in E, it's the fear of God, the respect of God that is important. You also have the covenant, but not in quite the same way as you find in Deuteronomy. And there's also a theology of history, namely that God works in history. One of the things we don't have in E is we don't have a creation story. If you take a look, it starts with Abraham. So maybe there never was an E creation story. But they're not interested in that stuff. It starts with Abraham. That's the beginning of the sacred history, is with Abraham. But interestingly enough, whereas the Torah starts the story of Abraham with chapter 12 of Genesis, the E text starts with chapter 15. So why don't we just take a quick look at it? Because when you start looking at the story of Abraham, you see there are different strands. It becomes pretty obvious in some ways. But if you take a look at the beginning of chapter 15, which is from Parshat Lech Lecha, you could be starting over again here, okay? It's on page 25. Sometime later, whatever that means, the word of the, which could be an addition, by the way, by an editor, the word of the Lord came to Abram in a vision. And this is the story of what's called the covenant between the pieces, where God promises him a son, but he's already done all of that. So here it's repeated, and you could start the whole Torah right here if you wanted, if you were starting with the E text. Because you can go back to the previous chapters and you can see that it's kind of it's the same stuff. All right. One of the things that we find in E, and we're going to see this in J as well, is that God can physically appear in more than one place at a time. And this was part of the way people believed in the ancient Near East, that their gods, you know, when you had a name of a place, the god of a place, that didn't mean that it was a different god from, you know, a similar named god at a different place. They believed that the statues were not actually the gods, but there was a place where the god could become manifest in the statue and could be in multiple places at the same time. And the E people believe the same thing about our God. And they probably, in the Mesopotamian traditions, they had three-dimensional statues of their gods. But in the Northwest Semitic traditions, namely the Canaanites and the Moabites, they didn't go for three-dimensional depictions of their god. They had these steles, pillars, in which God's images were carved into the image. And the early Israelite notion of God is utilizing that kind of thing, only there are no images. They're just blank. Because we have found Israelite shrines with blank steles. So it was very much part of the Northwest Semitic religious tradition to worship God, to have your God be manifest in a particular place, but that didn't mean it wasn't the only place your God was. But the idea that there's a physical stele is something that shows up in both E and J. And we'll actually look at a famous text when we get to J about that. So the notion is that God can, and you can understand why the P people and especially the D people didn't like this, because it was too close to what their neighbors were doing. But it was the common spiritual heritage of the Northwest Semitic civilization, which is where our tradition emerged out of. Thelma, you look like you want to ask something.
No.
Okay.
I'm trying to digest.
Anybody have any questions about that?
And that last point is, seems not too much different than what we did during the end of Nila, with the ark open and people walking in front of it, and probably there are other synagogues throughout the world that may be doing a very similar practice, and there may be some who stand in front of the Aron who feel that they're, whatever it is, they're one-on-one with God right there, but somewhere in Los Angeles.
Well, yeah, exactly. And it comes to the heart of, if you can worship God anywhere, how come you need to have a building, and what does it mean to have an ark? And do you feel that not only in the synagogue, but in the ark, there is, as it were, a kind of thickening of the presence of God instead of just walking outside? And this is an old argument. It goes back thousands of years. And the D people would say, no, you know, there's no presence of God in your building. You know, you read the Torah, that's fine, but that's as close as you're going to get.
Yes, to Los Angeles, there was 3 hours later, so that's right here.
Okay, so what do we know about the dating and location of E? Well, we know from a number of references in it that it comes from the north. That E is a northern tradition, that it came out of the northern kingdom. And I've given you some references there. There seems to be also thematic connections to Deuteronomy, which is, again, some people feel Deuteronomy is a kind of outgrowth of E. So when you look at the prophet Hosea, you look at the stories of Samuel and the Elijah traditions, it's very much a northern kind of thing. And so people feel that the origin of E is the local traditions and stories of the patriarchs and everything else from the north, the northern tribes. In addition, so the dating of it is from the 10th to 9th century BCE. That's as close as we could get. So it's pretty old. In other words, it goes back to the time of the division of the kingdom between, or even earlier, between the south and the north. And one of the things that you find in E is the use of material that was probably part of earlier oral epics. That we know, and we'll look at that when we look at early texts, there were epic cycles of various, traditions about the patriarchs and about God and the Exodus that were probably part of oral epics, like, you had Homer, and that you had bards and minstrels who would chant these things, and also about the various kings and so on and so forth. So there seems to be a strong element of the use of material that comes from an earlier oral epic in the E material. Yes, Dan?
Does this date from the origin of Hebrew?
Well, yeah, that's a good point. In other words, the earliest we have for written Hebrew doesn't go much further back than this, so people weren't writing stuff down yet. It's only in the period of, David and Solomon and subsequently afterwards that people were probably starting to write stuff down. Okay. The J source. So the J source is huge. And again, a lot of scholars don't want to even talk about the separation between J and E. They're talking about the JE because, if you look back at it, you'll see that they were edited together into one text. But J starts with the creation story, only their creation story is the Adam and Eve story. It's not chapter 1. And they've got the flood story, their own version of it, the post-flood story. This is where a lot of the stuff of Abraham comes from, and Isaac and Jacob, and the whole huge complex of the story of Joseph, which is a novel in and of itself. I mean, it takes the large part of the book of Genesis is the story of Joseph and his brothers, and it's mostly a J composition, and you could just take it out, and it's like it's a novella. So there's a strong, and then, you've got the oppression, you have stories of Moses, the liberation. There's some older sources that use a large part of the book of Numbers is J, the narrative parts, and the last little bit of the death of Moses. So J could be an independent book if you take it away from all the other sources. And in fact, there was a guy who actually published a translation of J that Harold Bloom did an introduction to called the Book of J. And the theory that came out of this was, which most people discounted, that the Book of J came out of the court of Solomon, and that its author was a woman. Well, there's absolutely no evidence for that. But the fact is that we know that it could have been, well, is it one person who wrote it? Because it's, people claim that if you look at the J as an independent literary source, it's this genius of literature. Or is it a school? Nobody knows. We know that it was composed in Judea. It's a southern text. There's a lot of southern stuff in it, stuff about Jerusalem. It's, and that sort of thing. And it's composed probably, the earliest is the 10th century BCE, which would put it right at the time of David and Solomon. Okay? So some people think it came out of the court of Solomon. We know that J uses a lot of earlier sources, again from oral traditions and some documentary stuff. And but some people say there is no J. P created J out of a whole bunch of disparate texts. But most people believe that a J is an independent source from the south that the P people then edited in with the E material into the first 4 books of the Torah. When we look at the theology of J, it's very evident, because this is where you get the Garden of Eden story, the Cain and Abel story, that human sin is the source of misfortune in the world. What's interesting is that although J has a very similar idea about God that E does, about how God can actually be manifest in a physical place, God is a universal God in J. Not just the God of Israel, but the God of the whole world. But that God, although God is the universal God, has a salvational relationship to Israel. One thing I didn't mention is both E and J, you find not only this notion of local shrines where you can have God manifest, but you also find angels. That's where the angels show up in the Torah, are in E and J. That they believed that God could have these messengers, and the angels, when they talk, often talk as if they are God, so there's no real measurable separation. and the angels don't have names, and that's kind of probably, that's fairly, kind of stricter monotheism. We know the angels had names, especially later on, but they're kind of semi-independent beings. But nonetheless, when you start looking at this material, J and E are not as strictly monotheistic as P and D are. Anybody have any other questions? We're going to spend a few more minutes on the earliest biblical texts. In other words, when you're looking at the totality of the Hebrew Bible, how can we, what text can we look at and say, this is really, really old? Well, if you take a look, first of all, poetry is old. And there are, the first 5 sources I mentioned here are really old poems that, well, you'll see. So Genesis 49 is the Testament of Jacob. It's very old. How do we know this poetry is old? Because the language is archaic. There are forms in the language that you don't find in the narrative parts. And it's like, the difference between Shakespearean poetry, a sonnet of Shakespeare, and a modern narrative. Okay? So the oldest text we have, I only put them in the order they show up in the Bible here, is the Song of the Sea, Exodus 15. Scholars believe that this thing comes from the 10th or 11th century BCE. The Testament of Jacob is also very old. In addition to which you have the Parshat Hazinu, which is this week, the song that Moses supposedly composes, and that is extremely old. And again, if you come Saturday, I'll show you why. It's got some significant theological differences from the rest of Deuteronomy, but also the Testament of Moses is a pretty old one as well. Judges chapter 5, that's the Song of Deborah. And it is so old, it may actually come from the time of Deborah, which of course would put it, back in the 11th century BCE. But it's extremely old. So you have here, like you have in Exodus, you have the story of the crossing of the Red Sea in narrative, and then you have the poetic version of it that's much older. In the story of Deborah, it's the same thing. You have the narrative of the story of the Deborah and the defeat of the Canaanites, and you have then a poetic version of it that's maybe the original telling of the story. Okay? You also have a very old text in 2 Samuel 2, which is the Song of Hannah. So let's take a quick look at that just so you can see. It's actually why did I say 2 Samuel 2? That's a mistake. Well, actually, that's not a mistake. That's an old poem too. That's David's eulogy for Saul and Jonathan. That's a pretty old poem. But one that I didn't include here was 1 Samuel's, the Song of Hannah, chapter 2. Oh, maybe it is a typo. When you look at this poem, it actually has nothing to do with the story of Hannah. It's on page 573. It's thematically, somebody made that connection, but it has absolutely nothing to do with the story. And if you remember, and one of the ways in which we know this is, if you look on page 574, the last verses refers to the king. Well, there was no king in the days of Hannah. That was during the time of the judges. So this may come from the time of Saul, which is, 30 years, 40 years after the story of Hannah. The point is that this is a very old poem. And what's the connection with the story of Hannah? Well, it evidently it's in verse 5. While the barren woman bears 7, the mother of many is forlorn. So in other words, Hannah is a barren woman and she becomes fertile, and the other wife is her opponent. And so maybe they found an allusion to that here. Whoever put it in, edited it into the book of Samuel. But when you look, if you were to take the poem out and you were just looking at it, it has nothing to do with Hannah. So it's a very, very old poem. Now, some of the book of Psalms, of course, is all poetry. And one of the hardest things to do is to date the Psalms. A couple of them are easy to date. By the waters of Babylon, there we sat and there we wept. Well, that's pretty easy, right? Or when we returned from Babylon, the one we sing before the grace after meals, the Birkat Hamazon, that's pretty easy. But there are virtually no aside from those, there's virtually no other historical events we can hook them to, although some of them have titles that say this was written by David when such and such happened. But nonetheless, we know that the way the book of Psalms was put together, the earlier Psalms, in other words, the low number ones, are probably the earliest. And that as you go on later, and some of the Psalms, it's evident, a lot of the Psalms seem to be liturgy that was done in local shrines and then eventually in the temple in Jerusalem. But one of the oldest Psalms, in most scholars' belief, is Psalm 29, which we utilize in our liturgy. So if you go to Psalm 29, which is found on page 1443, if you look at the picture of God in this psalm, it is a very early idea about God. And there was a theory that in fact that this originally was a Canaanite poem to their God that got changed into the Israelite God. And not everybody accepts that anymore, but one of the main sources of Canaanite literature was a city called Ugarit, which is on the Mediterranean coast in what is Syria. You've got Israel, then Lebanon, then Syria. Syria has an extensive Mediterranean coast. So there was a city that was dug up there called Ugarit, in which they found thousands of tablets. And among that, they found a lot of literature, including poetry. And scholars have studied the Psalms in light of Ugaritic poetry, and they see a lot of cultural connections there, even though the Ugaritic poetry is much older. So some people think that this psalm shows a lot of characteristics of Ugaritic poetry. But its picture of God is a very ancient one. So because of language and thematics, people feel this is one of the oldest psalms in the book of Psalms. But there are several others: Psalm 68, Psalm 74, Psalm 82, Psalm 95, and one of the most interesting ones is Psalm 104. We will look at this next week, but Psalm 104, which is one of my favorites, and it's found on 1540, is an amazing creation psalm. Some people think it's kind of the rough draft of Genesis 1. But what's really interesting is there's an Egyptian hymn called the Hymn to Aten, which comes from the time of Akhenaten, the great monotheistic reformer of ancient Egypt, who preceded, ancient Israel, who had a monotheistic, decided to become a monotheist in effect, and only worship the sun god Aten. There is a hymn from that time, which if you put it side by side with Psalm 104, it's almost as if the person who wrote Psalm 104 had read the hymn to Aten. There are so many similarities between the two, it's fascinating. But, not likely that it happened directly, but some of these things get floating around and start using it. So Psalm 104 is a very old poem, and it's also its picture of the creation story is very old, and you find that also in Psalm 74.
Is the Hebrew very old?
Yeah, but okay, it's not as archaic as the stuff you find in Exodus 15 or stuff like that, but it's got some elements to it. But it's that connection with the hymn of Aten which is so fascinating. Now, just a few other things I want to mention before we today. One of the things that's fascinating about is that the Bible often footnotes, so to speak, sources that are lost. So, Genesis chapter 14, because of the language of it and the picture of Abraham as a warrior, some people think that this is an ancient document of non-Israelite origin that talks about Abraham, because it's the story how Abraham, there's a war between a bunch of kings on one side and another bunch of kings on the other, and they take Lot, Abraham's nephew, and they hold him for hostage, and Abraham gathers together his own army, and he goes there and he's saved. It's like a picture of Abraham that just doesn't exist in the rest of the Abrahamic stories. And so most scholars believe this is from some other source, possibly even a non-Israelite source. Okay? The Ten Commandments, most scholars believe that it's an earlier source that the E people used. It's not written by E. In Joshua chapter 10, verse 13, and this is not the only place that it's mentioned, a book called the Book of Yashar is mentioned. And Yashar means kind of straight or upright. Like if you walk on a straight path, you are an upright person. So there was a book called the Sefer HaYashar that was used as a source in Joshua, and it's mentioned, I believe, in the Torah as well.
Which book was that? Where did it originate, the Yashar?
It's an Israelite book that doesn't exist anymore, that later books quoted. That's why I'm saying it's a footnote. In Numbers, there's a book mentioned called the Book of the Wars of the Lord, which evidently was an epic about how God defeated various nations for the Israelites. We don't have the Book of the Wars of the Lord. A guy in the Middle Ages wrote something called the Book of the Wars of the Lord, but that's not the original. It was a philosophical book. Likewise, there's actually a book called the Sefer HaYashar, which is a book, again, post-Middle Ages book, took the name. So this is another work that was probably like an epic poem that we don't have anymore. We know from the books of Kings that there were royal archives called the Annals of the Kings of Israel and the Annals of the Kings of Judah that were used by the Deuteronomic historians as their sources for writing it, because they say in numerous places, if you want to know more about this particular king, go read it in the book of the Annals of the Kings of Israel, because they weren't interested in telling you every little thing they did. They only wanted to tell you whether they liked them or not and whether they thought he was a good king. We know, for example, that there is a whole section of the book of Proverbs that is a virtual, well, it's taken from an Egyptian book of Proverbs that's over 1,000 years before it. So how did it go from being an Egyptian book of Proverbs over 1,000 years before the book of Proverbs was edited into the book of Proverbs? The answer is there was probably an Aramaic translation during the Persian period of the Egyptian book of Proverbs, and somebody read it and translated parts of it into Hebrew. And you can look at them and compare them. They're identical. It's a chunk of the book of Proverbs, not the whole book, because the book of Proverbs comes from a variety of sources. And again, I mentioned to you Psalm 104 as the hymn from the hymn dot. And one last thing, we have in the Torah what are obviously fragments of earlier stories, possibly oral, which the Torah is quoting, but doesn't give us the whole story. Like the story of Enoch. You know, you have all those lists, so-and-so begat so-and-so, he begat so-and-so, and then when it comes to Enoch, it says, Enoch walked with God, and then, he was no more because God took him. In other words, Enoch never dies. So there's later stuff about how Enoch is taken up to heaven, and he's turned into an archangel. So there was a story about Enoch who was carried off into heaven, and there was a whole mythological story about this guy, which we don't have, but the Torah kind of alludes to it. The sons of God, chapter 6, which is just before the Noah story. It's the weirdest story. It's about how these angelic creatures come down from heaven and they have sex with human women, and then they produce these giants, the Nephilim. Now, there's something going on here. There obviously is a lot more, but for whatever reason, they didn't tell us the rest of the story. So
R rating.
It's a really weird text. I mean, it's really strange, and and why is it there? And it's there because it's telling you one of the reasons why the flood comes. It's in other words, it's quoted as a rationale for the flood, and then there's a second rationale for the flood, which is that the earth becomes full of violence. So there's two reasons for the flood from two different sources. And then you have one of the weirdest texts of all. Why don't we take a quick look at it? It's Exodus chapter 4, verse 24. It's only, 2 verses. It's in the story of Moses. And so Exodus 4. And this is where, Moses has gone and gotten married, and God tells him he's got to go back to Egypt. And so he starts on his way, and this is on page 120, and it seems to come out of nowhere. It says, at a night encampment on the way, the Lord encountered him, we're assuming it's Moses, and sought to kill him.
Yes.
So Zipporah, who's his wife, took a flint and cut off her son's foreskin, touched his legs, whose legs? Moses or the son's, with it, saying, you are truly a bridegroom of blood to me. And when God, let him, Moses, alone, she added a bridegroom of blood because of the circumcision. What the heck is going on here? Okay, it's this weird little fragment where after going through all the way of convincing Moses that he's got to go down to Egypt and go to Pharaoh, God all of a sudden tries to kill him? There's an old story here that's, for whatever reason, only a tiny piece of it got edited in. Was this a kind of initiation Moses had to go through? There's tons of stuff that's been written about this text as to try to explain it and where it may have come from and so on. But we just have, in the end, we don't really know. It's a very, very weird incident. But so all of the ones I gave you are actually pretty weird. The one I didn't mention was Nimrod. Nimrod is one of the ancestors of Noah, the descendants of Noah, and it's evident there's a lot more about this guy, just from the little bit that is quoted about him. And in fact, in the Midrash, he becomes the guy who tries to kill Abraham before Abraham leaves Ur. Because Abraham's going around preaching monotheism, and Nimrod's the king of Babylon, and he doesn't want him to do that. So, yes, Bert.
Some of the fragments of lost stories, is it perhaps just an easy answer that the great actors, they overlooked it?
No, not that they overlooked it. They obviously, but why did they even put these things in the first place?
Well, because maybe a larger part was there, and it said making sense, and they took everything out of those 3.
Yeah, exactly. They evidently felt the need to keep these little bits in, but they didn't, you're right. They could have, maybe originally, there was a much larger part about the sons of God in the J text or whatever, and they got rid of it. Except for this little bit. They evidently felt the need to keep something in, but not everything, because they didn't, it was a kind of a sketchy story. Or they figured, everybody knows what this is about. Right?
Yeah, that's the
I just need, because there's a lot of times when the Torah is not what you would call a detailed sort of narrative. And the way I like to envision it is it's like looking at and here we're dating ourselves, and a photo album, right? Where you have snapshots, and the snapshot focuses in on a particular time and place. And then, 6 months later, there's another picture, right? And the Torah is like that. It focuses in on certain things with great detail, and then it kind of skips the sort of between stuff to go on to the next one. Okay, we'll call it a night, and next week, we're into archaeology.